Are the senses a thought? A viewer asked the question, when I'm working with the senses, isn't that just another thought? Or I feel like I'm thinking about the senses as much as I'm experiencing the senses directly. I'm paraphrasing the question, but this points to a really important distinction. So I wanted to make a video about this. So when I make videos about direct sense work, working in the visual sense, the auditory sense fields, the physical sense field, these are ways of investigating the non-dual experience of reality, which isn't an experience. It's the absence of an experience that's overlaid upon direct sensing. So sometimes I'll make the disclaimer that if you haven't had that first shift, if you haven't gone through awakening, this kind of work may be difficult. And you may be better served working on that first shift, that first awakening, which is described in detail in the book I wrote. Also, it's described in the playlist called Awakening Approaches. This doesn't mean that without having had that shift, there's no value at all to working with the sense fields. It just means that this kind of work is very subtle. And without that initial shift in identity, it can be really slippery, very tricky to discern these distinctions I'm pointing to. So that's the first disclaimer when it comes to working in the sense fields in the way I describe. The reason for this is that until there's a significant shift in how you experience identity, it's very challenging to pull attention out of that constantly self-referring ego structure that tells itself stories endlessly and redirect attention into the pure sense fields. We can do it for a second or a fraction of a second, or maybe for a few seconds, but very quickly that turns into thinking about me, about what I'm doing wrong, analysis about the process itself. And this happens so quickly and sneakily that we don't realize how quickly we're bound back into thought. So our physical experience of moment-to-moment reality is multiple flashes of sense experiences that are almost instantly intertwined with thought. And the identity structure, the sense of being a me, is what's preserved ongoing in thought. And it's just periodically referencing the sense fields as needed. Once we have that initial shift, or we break that constant spell of self-referential thought, then it's much easier to start to differentiate between what a thought is and what a sound is and what a sensation is. Now, I understand this might sound absurd to some people who may have not had an awakening or had that initial shift. But if you really put effort into listening to sound without thinking about it at all, without thinking about yourself, without adding labels to it, without mind wandering, usually you'll pretty quickly realize it's very hard to do. You might be able to do it for a few seconds. If you're able to do it longer, that's fine, of course. But if you find this challenging, then I would recommend working on a question like, who am I? Or where am I? Or looking for that center or that identity structure that seems to be you. And looking until there's a shift and a certain effortlessness comes forth, and you experience yourself to be quite a bit more vast, more subtle, more boundless than you had previously, until you see through the hypnotic pull of thought. And when this happens, it's usually quite obvious. And that's what I would recommend if working directly in the sense fields is too challenging or slippery at this time. Or alternatively, you can spend time working on who am I, that initial shift, investigating the experience of I or self internally, investigating the nature of thought, and then spend some time working in the sense fields if you feel like it. But primarily, it's important to really work on that first identity shift, because without that, all of this can turn into talk very quickly. And you can miss the initial and very important insight that leads into these deeper and more subtle insights like non-duality. So with all that said, to answer the question, isn't working with the senses directly just another form of thought? And the answer to that experientially is no. It is possible to experience a sound clearly, fully, with no self-reflection. It's deeply enjoyable. It's profoundly intimate, beyond anything the mind can produce, beyond anything or any level of satisfaction any description can ever give you, or any label. And again, it's there all the time. It's always this way. But the experience of it, which again isn't exactly an experience because the experience and experiencer split subsides, and that's where one comes into a knowing of what I'm pointing to here. So even to call it an experience isn't exactly right. But for conventional terms, once it's experienced, it's very clear that this is really how it is. There's no other way it could be. And that illusion of the mind and thought of reflecting back, making a mental image, and then standing apart from that image as a seeming self is actually a lot of work. And it's illusory in nature. And it's amazing we do it for so long until we stop doing it, or until it stops happening. So when I'm pointing to listening or hearing without a subject, and really without an object, that is not a thought. The sound can be perceived and beheld without thought. Definitely. Sensation, similarly, can be beheld, experienced, known without thinking, without reflecting in a knowing way. It's like pure knowing, but it's knowing experientially. It's like a slap in the face that happens so fast you don't have time to think about it, and then the thinking comes after. It's just that immediate experience. But this doesn't just happen 1 second. It's not an instant experience that's gone immediately, then you can think about it like a slap in the face. It's a slap in the face that never ends. It's always there. But it's not dramatic. It's just sound. Just sensation. And once we have access to this, it becomes a very, very potent practice, because the exploration of it that I describe in words actually happens spontaneously. So the exploration of whether there's a boundary between one sound and another sound happens automatically out of natural curiosity on its own side. It's not your curiosity. It's built in. It's a fascination, an enjoyment, an endless penetration. And this is where that description of natural inquiry arises. There's nothing else to inquire about because there's only this. So it's naturally fascinating. It's also sublime, neutral, locationless. It's just right. And there's nothing to do and nowhere to go. And there's nothing to self-reflect. It's not a reflection. It's too real to be a reflection. It's too real to be dualistic or to have something aware of it. This is non-dual. So these exercises I describe to begin to investigate where the boundary between one seeming object of experience and another seeming object of experience occurs, and whether it occurs at all, are really just entry points to start to investigate this non-dual nature that is undeniable once it's clarified. So it's kind of a alchemical magic trick that by looking for the boundary between the one that's aware and the one it's aware of and their relationship is seen to be completely illusory. You could say that a first awakening or a deep awakening is seeing that there is no specific self. You can't find a self. It's not the full realization of no self or anatta, but it's a seeing that you're not going to find a me, a self, an I, a center, if you really look for it. And then you could say this shift, this non-dual shift, is seeing that the relationship between subject and object that underlies the sense of a self is also illusory. Relationship is illusory. Separation, distance, it's illusory. These are all concepts. So you can see that these more subtle concepts are the ones that you really start to get at once you've had that shift and you've started investigating this stuff directly. So a more full answer to the question is that there's one layer of thought that is actually quite distanced from direct experience, and it's sort of a barrier of thought that keeps us in our egoic movement, in our minds. And once that barrier of thought is broken, that shift occurs, that awakening occurs, now we have access to a much more fundamental layer of thought, a layer of thought that makes the world look a certain way, makes it appear as if things that are so taken for granted that they exist that we would never even question them, like there is a such thing as relationship between subject and object, right? These are very subtle thoughts, but they're thoughts. These are what we're investigating when we're investigating non-dual, when we're looking into the sense fields in specific ways. And this layer of thought can also be broken, seen through. So hopefully this video explained why that can be challenging to do when that first layer of thought is really just keeping you bound into self-referential experiences internally. But once that's broken, we can start looking around and seeing, well, wait a minute. What is this thought that says the sound is over there and I'm over here when I can't actually find that in experience? So let me look closer. Is it a thought? Is it even there? And all of a sudden that experience starts feeling quite different. It's pure experience, no experiencer. But you got to do that work, usually. For some people, it just hits them over the head, and that's fine too. So there is thought entangled with the sense fields. And after we break through that first layer, that identity layer, and we have more direct access to the sense fields, then we can start to chip away at the thoughts that are intertwined with the senses in a much more immediate and ongoing way than the self-referential thoughts. And then the paradigm of subject and object can take a critical hit. And that's non-duality.